crypto's like the worst in nomenclature. Like we pick these really strange words that just don't resonate with people. What that does, though, is it tends to create a tight community of people who are on the in, are psyched to be on the in, and that has grown. And now, of course, what we talked about with Telegram and the TON blockchain, they're using the word wallet, but that's as crypto as they get, right? They really don't mention blockchain within the Telegram messaging app. So you can get a wallet, and most people know what a wallet is. I mean, wallet's on your phone. Apple uses that word. So I don't think that's super technical, but I do think we unlock more consumer usage through, hiding technical complexity. And now we're seeing a lot of people do that. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Mind with CoinFund. For those tuning in for the first time, my name is David Packman, and I'm head of venture investments and one of the managing partners here at CoinFund. And I'm with my fabulous co-host, CoinFund's CEO, founder, and managing partner, my partner, Jake Brookman. Hey, Jake, how are you?
Hey, David. Thanks for that nice intro. Great to be here today. It's the fall. We are, 10 or 11 days away from the election that everyone's waiting for. Deal flow is picking up. What have you been up to these past 2 weeks?
Oh my God, it's all been deals. It's been all deals all the time. We had a quiet late summer, which always gets a little scary because we like doing deals, but I don't know. We've had, something like 4 or 6 this week that are crushing us, but we're enjoying it. I'm super happy to see active deal flow in a number of different segments. I also feel like there's a story you can put together right now about crypto if you look at data. That is maybe one of the most optimistic moments we've had in a long time. I think about all the activity we've been talking about on the TON blockchain and Telegram, something like, maybe 500,000 daily active wallets, but maybe 30 to 40 million created wallets on that blockchain. I think about the great, exciting early adoption of our portfolio company, the game Off the Grid and Gunzilla, which is something like, I don't know, the number one game on Epic right now, and somewhere north of 9 million users in a short amount of time, a week or two. Obviously, with games, you care more about long-term retention, but still, this is a Web3 game built on top of crypto with some incredible early adoption that has got a lot of people excited. Obviously, the stablecoin numbers at 180 billion, going up every day. What would you add to this, Jake, this optimistic picture?
Yeah, definitely. This has been the year of institutional adoption kind of stories, right? Like we kicked off the year in January with the Bitcoin ETF. We got the Ethereum ETF in the summer. We've had a bunch of TradFi players like BlackRock, Franklin Templeton, and Fidelity really starting to play in this space. Actually saw BlackRock across the table on a deal, like on a seed stage deal. So it sounds like they might be even starting to invest in stuff. We've called up a bunch of banks all over the world, me and some of the analysts on the team, and we've asked them, what are you doing in blockchain? And it turns out a lot of banks out there in the US and abroad are betting on digital assets being a really big thing in the future. And while the regulation isn't fully there in the US today, maybe like demand and product clarity isn't there elsewhere yet, it's definitely like a bet that a lot of these institutions are making on the future of digital assets. So that's not something that's talked about that much on crypto Twitter, and I just think it's a really interesting kind of disconnect there. And by the way, we can maybe on this show we could talk a little bit about, you mentioned ton the consumer adoption view versus the institutional adoption view. I feel like they've always been kind of at odds with each other. So I'm seeing a bunch of data points sort of in that area, and I think this is all going to get kind of consolidated once we get through this election period and we have a little bit more certainty around what's going to happen. But the nice thing that, I'm kind of gathering is that it doesn't really matter who's going to win the US election. It's going to be really about, when is this legislation going to come through? And it feels like that's starting to be a much more bipartisan effort going into 2025. So Starting to feel really bullish for crypto, David, is the headline.
I think that's right, even though I try not to get too excited because, boy, the booms and busts in crypto can be pretty severe. But it does feel like we've got real builders building applications that are attracting users, and hopefully we have a more friendly regulatory climate, at least in the US. We've had a nice one in UK and EU and a bunch of other, Eastern countries. And so I'm feeling good too. Today, we're doing something a little unusual for us. It's just going to be the two of us. We are your hosts and your guests. And, Jake, you've been really my crypto spirit guide since 2017. You're an OG crypto user, investor. You're a crypto native developer, builder, miner. You're as hands-on as it gets. Let's get our hands dirty. And I was hoping to today really dive into how developers think about solving big, thorny problems. As an investor, one of your themes, you don't necessarily prognosticate it, maybe you put it in this way, but I see this in you. You believe that if really high quality developers are working to solve extremely hard problems, that tends to pay off in various different ways as those things come to market. I tend to want to know how they're going to come to market, but you have a conviction generally built around developers who solve big, thorny problems. And man, it seems like there's a bunch of those focused on solving them through Web3. ZK comes to mind, decentralized AI comes to mind. I mean, heck, even, the early consensus mechanisms of Bitcoin and Ethereum were like hard technical problems to solve. Maybe even scaling blockchains, hard technical problem. So maybe we can start talking about just the big problems that have been solved and are being solved in Web3, and maybe why that you
Yeah.
build conviction in that as good investment areas.
Yeah. I just want to be clear also that I've learned a lot that, over the course of doing investing for about a decade now, that, technology is also not the only thing that matters, of course. And actually, a lot of that I learned from your experience, David. And, what I react to when I think about solving hard problems is a few different things. It's the fact that, even today, blockchain is still a pretty nascent space. There's a lot of capabilities that we have in Web 2 that we don't have in Web 3. Like, I'll give you a very simple example. Can you do, a private inference of a AI model today? Not really, because there's some specific technologies that are needed for that. Those technologies are really nascent or very expensive. And so there's a bunch of hard problems like that, that if you want to operate in a Web3 world, like truly, like you need to go solve those problems. And you know what? Sometimes those problems aren't actually like worth solving because we can do something adequate using our Web 2 toolbox. And that's what I always think about. I always think about how, decentralization and like Web3 primitives are just tools in a toolbox that we have that allows us to basically put out products and services well. But every once in a while, there comes around an innovation among those tools that is just so interesting and so transformative that it becomes like really clear this is going to be really big. Fundamentally, I think the mental shift to just blockchains back in 2011 was just like totally different way of thinking about money or storing data collectively or even like building a public good. And I always say, the legacy of blockchains, it's not going to be efficiency technology. It's not going to be cryptocurrency. It's not going to be, rails for banks. What really blockchains have brought to the table fundamentally is a way of creating open public, global, governable, digital, robust goods, which is a way of bringing certain kinds of products and services to market. So that's like a little bit of, I guess, about the philosophy of how I think about it. But then, like, who can in actuality put products into market and make them really successful, make them utilized, make them big? Because we've had a lot of like proposals in Web3. Like, we had every kind of supply side blockchain basically implemented, every kind of layer 1 and layer 2 and side chain and ZK rollup and optimistic rollup and plasma chain and this and that. But there's another part of the equation, which is the demand side. If these technologies aren't serving useful purposes, if they're not competing with the traditional way that we do things, that we put these products in the market, then I don't think it's going to be worth it in the end. And so what we've learned, I think, at CoinFund is also to identify the founders and the go-to-markets and the processes and the teams that are not just creating these technologies and solving these very hard problems, but are able to put them into the world in a way where they're productive. And that's our skill.
What do you think most skilled technical developers are focused on building in crypto right now, and why? So take a minority of the most skilled devs who are doing stuff in Web3. What are they focused on and why are they doing it?
Of course, there's a bunch of different areas. I think L1 development has sort of become a little bit more slow. There's a lot of players in L1, and scalability of blockchains is generally not being done on the L1 level today. It's really being done on mostly on L2 level, and in these ideas of parallelizing EVMs and like putting, state into memory and things like this. There's a scalability track that has been in play, and it's mostly been focused on parallelized EVM, layer 2. It's kind of actually an interesting time to launch a layer 2 right now. I know Fuel just went to mainnet the other day, and they're kind of coming in. They were actually their V1 actually beat Optimism to market. They were one of the first ones to launch a layer 2 into production. But with V2, I think they have this, much more complete or vision complete product that they're putting out. And it's an interesting time to be in L2 because, we don't see that demand side yet. Like, this field is for the taking. Is it going to be Web3 apps, DeFi apps? Is it going to be banks and Visa and people looking for high throughput? Is it going to be app chains? That remains to be seen. But in L2, I think we have some space to figure it out, and companies can compete. Then we've seen, I'll name another couple of areas. Zero knowledge has been a very technical and kind of esoteric area for a long time. What we're starting to see is that this area is starting to generate demand, and most of that demand is coming from layer 2s and ZK rollups and basically like supply side blockchain technology. Also, by the way, WorldCoin, I just tweeted this the other day. I think they own about 80% right now of the market share of all on-chain zero knowledge proof verifications.
And that's
And
because they use one every time you sign up, right? They create a new proof. And
right.
then is it also implicated? Is ZK implicated every time you utilize WorldCoin to verify yourself or validate yourself?
Yeah, so there's a number of processes like inside of the orb that protects user privacy, uses zero knowledge proofs. We can get into that. But what's interesting is it's not actually, I don't believe it's coming from blockchain tech. So they just launched World Chain like last week, right? And World Chain is a optimistic rollup. It's not actually
Not ZK.
using, yeah, ZK kind of fundamentally there. So it's interesting that WorldCoin it is a, sort of infrastructural demand driver of zero knowledge proofs, but not for the purposes necessarily of doing a blockchain, actually for the purposes of protecting privacy. But what I wanted to say about ZK, so we're in this world where we're starting to see this demand. The number of kind of verifications is growing. And a lot of people in ZK have sort of posited that decentralized zero knowledge proving networks are going to be like this very interesting and competitive thing. And what we're actually seeing is that companies like our portfolio company, Sindri, which we had Stacia on the show the other day. So check out that episode if you want to dive into Sindri a little bit more. But basically, what Sindri is showing is that a lot of developers who are developing in ZK, they want to have a SaaS. They want to have humans who can help them. They want to have SLAs. They want to have like certain guarantees about, how expensive the proofs are going to be. They want support across multiple proving systems, not just one or two, as these bigger networks tend to do. And they're willing to pay for that. We're starting to see some demand materialize there, product market fit, some little early revenue. And I think Sindri is, doing really well. So that's another area, zero knowledge. And I think AI, I have to say AI is another area because it's just there's been so much activity. I just did Delphi's podcast with Casey Caruso and Will Wolf. I thought that was a really cool one, mostly because the three of us are all computer science people and investors in decentralized AI. So it was like a really good up to date view of what's happening there. But the latest thing is that there's a bunch of really difficult problems at the core of that space. There's a lot of noise. There's a lot of people like, we're doing chatbots, we're doing this, we're doing that. We're bringing LLMs to the blockchain, we're aggregating compute. But the truth is that the core difficult problems, there's only a few of them. One is, okay, you got compute, what are you going to do with it? What are the applications that you run on top of this aggregated compute that actually matter to your customers? Is it like financialization? Is it being able to deploy some high-end GPUs in order to train something or to do inference on something, et cetera, et cetera? So that's a really hard problem, is like like the second order applications built on top of compute. The very hard problem that I've been talking about a lot with you and elsewhere is decentralized training, which is now getting kind of more consensus that this is an interesting area, a very difficult area. But the milestone has been 10 billion parameter LLM has been now trained on fully decentralized Rails. This is something that 12 months ago, a lot of people, a lot of very smart people have said, this is impossible. It cannot be done.
Let's stay on this one for a second. Is the hard part of decentralized training the fact that there is high latency due to the physical location of having a whole bunch of different GPUs in different locations? Is it because you're using different GPUs, like they're not all H100s? What is the hard thing about decentralized training?
Okay, this is like an interesting story to tell. So let me tell you this story like as quickly as I can. But essentially, training large models, which is what is necessary to create the progress that we have just seen over the last couple of years. Like basically the person who created that progress was Ilya Sutskever. He said, guys, if we just get a huge data center of GPUs and if we just train this giant neural network, I bet you it's going to be smart. And he was right. But nobody had done that up until that point. So you have this problem of, I have this data center I have to build now, and I have to parallelize a bunch of GPUs, and nobody has ever done that before. How do I do this? So I dare say that some of these early kind of experiments, while successful and while demonstrating that there is a scaling hypothesis that's working out here, and these models are becoming more intelligent, they kind of like clobbered the data center together. Like they did the minimum viable thing required for this, right? The easiest thing. And so the result is that, like when you're training a neural network, and especially when you're doing that back propagation, if people know how neural network training works, is so you sort of go forward and you get the output, and then you compare that to what the output should have been, and you calculate the gradient, and then you go backward and update all the weights and all of the nodes of the neural network. That part is going to be really hard to do when your neural network is like billions and billions of nodes long, because you have to go and update every single one. So you need a lot of memory. And the way these processes have been put together is that the way to make this actually tractable is to have really, really high speed interconnects between your GPUs. So you can send those parameters really quickly to all the nodes that you need to send them to. And this is sort of like the minimum viable, kind of thing. And it worked and it showed the result, and that's fantastic. But what nobody kind of sat down and did was say, hey, by the way, what if I had a decentralized network of nodes and the interconnects between them were really slow, like 200 megabytes a second, like we have on the internet? I know your internet is faster, David, but like in that scenario, what can we do? Can we train a large model? Is it even possible? Most people in San Francisco are not really like focused on that problem because there's this race to get to AGI. That's sort of the zeitgeist of what people in a market are doing today. But there are some people who kind of have taken a step back and said, wait a minute, but if we solve that problem, what could we achieve? And the answer to that is you could achieve much greater distribution of AI in the world, because now you can go to networks that don't require high-end hardware. You could now use commodity hardware. And you could do this collectively on the internet because now your framework might be able to support slow interconnects. And by the way, you can throw some crypto in there and say, hey, anyone who wants to train a large model can crowdfund it using a token. And we've been doing that for a very long time. This has been part and parcel of what we do in the crypto space since the ICO world. And so what's starting to be shown now is that, David, it turns out if people sit down and work at a problem and use their brain and ask, like, how can we get this solved? It turns out we can solve hard problems. We're starting to do that. And we're starting to see a progression of models that are essentially like increasing in parameter count. Now, parameter count and intelligence correlate variously, but at a high level, the more parameters we see being able to be trained in this decentralized way, the more intelligent decentralized models are going to become. And decentralized models tend to be open models. And that's the competitive advantage.
So let's talk about what this unlocks. Many of the academics I've talked to in AI have been frustrated by the expense to prototype or create new models on centralized infrastructure because the cost of that is out of reach of most academics, even the richest academic institutions. Harvard's not going to build, MIT's not going to build a $10 billion data center with GPUs in it to let their computer science people train models there. So they've always been forced to kind of create smaller parameter models at lower cost. But if they can have access to lower cost, decentralized, large GPU clusters to train just on the model training side of things, it's an unlock for academics. Tell us about your view of the commercial unlock that's made possible because of this.
Definitely. So we've seen this concept of openness today, right? We've heard a lot about open models. We've heard about models from Meta that are open. What does openness mean today? Openness means that Mark Zuckerberg is giving us the weights and biases of a neural network that he's trained, let's say Llama 3.1, 70 billion, whatever it is. And if you go and listen to Mark Zuckerberg's interview on Dwarkesh he did recently, Mark Zuckerberg will tell you that the moment that it becomes convenient for Meta to close source this process, these weights, they will do so, and they will use it to make money for Meta, which is fine and expected. And in the process of giving you this open model, the thing that Mark Zuckerberg isn't giving us is the data upon which the model is trained. We don't know what the data is. It's not necessarily giving you the hardware setup or the training setup, although some folks who put out these models also publish kind of the very technical papers on how to do this. But here's my point. When I think about kind of true openness and true open source, I think about GitHub. In GitHub, you go to a repository and you one-click fork something and then you go work on it. How far are we from doing that with models? And the answer is, in Mark Zuckerberg's world, really, really far. Can't do that because we don't even have the data. And so this openness that's being touted today is really kind of a facetious, tongue-in-cheek openness that says, yeah, you can have the weights and you can fine-tune things and you can see how it works and you can run experiments, and that's great. But what you can't really truly effectively do is fork the model and compete with it. And so when I think about these networks that are coming around and the commercial aspects of them, then I start to think about which openness is detrimental and which openness is good. And so we've seen, for example, Stability AI come out with also very open models. And we've seen, I don't think like a lot of revenue is generated on inferencing open models from Stability. It's because I could run Stable Diffusion 2.0 or whatever on my MacBook. And so one of our companies, Pluralis, is working on a little bit of a different model, which is commercial and open at the same time. And here's how it works. It will be a network that trains large neural networks, but that training will be essentially sharded among the different training participants. So that in itself is a very hard problem. It's what's the algorithm that allows, it's called model parallelism. How do we form this model? And then how do we guarantee that this training even converges to something that works, et cetera, et cetera. But we have a lot of confidence that we can do that. And once the model is trained, The commercial aspect is that to do the inference in this model, you have to go back to the people who train those weights. So in other words, the weights of this model are actually closed, and that is called non-extractability of weights. And that closedness creates a commercial potential here for people who really want this model. But the way in which this model is open is the much better way. If someone wants to come in and say, I want to fork this model and I have my own, I don't know, $60 million or something to train another one, I can do that because it is open by way of setup rather than open by way of weights. And I think that's a much more productive openness.
Let's shift gears a little bit to make sure we chat about some other topics of tech's intersection with crypto. One of the things that seems to have unlocked some more mass consumer usage in the last several, I don't know, really months is we talked about scalability. So we have blockchains that can scale. That means just more transactions per second, which means more simultaneous users. But also the cost of transactions have come way down. I mean, one argument about why NFTs, when they were first coming on the scene several years ago, were expensive was because transaction costs on Ethereum were expensive, $30, $40, $50, $60 gas fees to buy or sell an NFT at certain times of the day, right? Depending on what's going on. Hard to sell a $2 NFT when gas fees are $15 or $30. But now we're down to pennies and we're approaching fractions of a penny to do a transaction on blockchain. So there's an argument actually that we wouldn't have meme coins without like much lower cost transactions on blockchains. We can argue about whether meme coins are good or not, but they do show like high volume and low transaction value on many of them. So first, do you agree with this observation? And second, what else do we think is unlocked now? I mean, you couldn't build a game on top of Web3 if every time you wanted to allow the user to buy or sell an item or even just receive an in-game item or give away an in-game item if the transactions were $5 or $10 even. So there's an argument that this is one of the reasons why we're going to see a surge of Web3 gaming right now. But what else do you see that's enabled by lower cost transactions?
I mean, essentially like anything that is high throughput, right? So we've looked at historically, like when, for example, DEXs came around, this is not AMMs necessarily, but just order book decentralized exchanges. One of the observations was that these exchanges can't really get liquidity unless they're market makers. And market makers are very, very unlikely to either come to these exchanges or be successful there because of high transaction fees. So normally, I've actually worked in this area in the past, but, normally market makers, what they need to do is they need to cancel and replace orders all the time. And in the context of a decentralized exchange, that meant putting in a transaction, paying the transaction fee, waiting for that transaction to get validated. And this would amount to a few minutes of work. Whereas, kind of in the quote unquote real world, you would have these market making maneuvers happen in like nanoseconds. And so there was a view that like these dexes are like really naive because they're just not workable for market making. Your question about meme coins, would meme coins exist with, if there weren't lower transaction fees? I don't know. You're talking to someone who at times has paid, a $100 or $200 transaction fee. But what makes that worth it? It's knowing that executing that transaction is going to create a bigger return than that and making it worth it, right? So even if transaction fees were higher, but people were like really convicted in the cat coin or whatever it is, maybe people would do it. It certainly makes it easier for a casual participant to come and participate, right? I remember that even like in periods of relatively low fees on Ethereum mainnet, we would still at times, essentially price out most of the people in the country of Argentina just because they have, different economics and they don't want to pay, those kinds of transaction fees, even though they might be low relative to an American perspective. So there's definitely that. I mean, obviously, the lower transaction fees that we have, the more participants we're going to be able to invite and have. And that's really what we want. So I think we've been doing exactly the right thing. What do you think, David? Over the years, there's always been this background question. Why are more mainstream people using crypto? And, there's been a lot of answers to this. I think you've been on the side of, with your work at Dapper Labs, for example, that we should hide some of the technical crypto elements. For example, having to pay a transaction fee and having to have a wallet to pay transaction fees. And that has been pretty successful in that context. What do you think about it?
Yeah, this is a UX question first and maybe a cost question second, but my view is always probably going back to just my Apple DNA that, the easier and more intuitive you make a technical product, the more people who will use it and the easier time you'll have keeping them. And crypto's just been insanely hard and confusing for most normies. It's taken me many years, just to get comfortable to understand the basics. It is not for the faint of heart. So even, and crypto's like the worst in nomenclature. Like we pick these really strange words that just don't resonate with people. What that does though, is it tends to create a tight community of people who are on the in, are psyched to be on the in. And that has grown. It's not a small community, crypto, right? I mean, I don't know, I've seen all sorts of estimations, but depending on how you just define it, 50 million to 200 million, crypto holders in the world, and maybe more. And now, of course, what we talked about with Telegram and the TON blockchain, they're using the word wallet, but that's as crypto as they get, right? They really don't mention blockchain within the Telegram messaging app. So you can get a wallet, and most people know what a wallet is. I mean, wallet's on your phone. Apple uses that word. So I don't think that's super technical, but I do think we unlock more consumer usage through, hiding technical complexity. And now we're seeing a lot of people do that. I mean, Dapper tried to do that early on after CryptoKitties, of course, but, they launched NBA Top Shot and NFL All Day by not using the word crypto or blockchain and, really trying to make it easy. And they did have tens of millions of users at their peak. So I like that approach. We're seeing that in gaming too. But the key for me is what unlocks a lot of consumer usage is a lot of developer experimentation to find what consumers want. And what attracts me to crypto still is its permissionlessness to launch applications. The harder you make it to launch new applications, the fewer ones there'll be, which means for less experimentation. The internet unlocked, 20 or 30 years of experimentation and innovation with tech because anyone could launch an internet application. And then the story of the internet is in 30 years is that becoming more and more centralized and restricted and controlled. If you want to launch a new feature in the HTML standard, if the 3 or 4 main browsers of the world don't support it, it doesn't really matter whether it's in the standard or not, right? We went from open to closed. So with Web3, we don't have that. We have, if it's in the blockchain, anyone can use it, anyone can do it. And there's good and bad of that. But what has been disappointing in the last several years is the not enough experimentation, not enough developer adoption and usage. And I think we're re-entering a period of developer abundance. We're seeing that in our data, number of deals we're seeing that at conferences. The part that excites me about lower transaction cost and less complexity is you can be a less sophisticated developer and launch applications. Okay, so Jake, here's how I bring it back to our earlier conversation with my final question for you. Probably the most practical use cases for LLMs right now is to reduce the burden of coding, right? Using coding copilots, it's really working. I like writing code, but the fact that I'm not writing nearly as much right now because I'm asking the LM to make it for me, it really works, right? I mean, it really works. Are we seeing, or when will we see the burden of writing smart contracts massively reduced, launching Web3 dApps by using AI?
Yeah, it's sort of an interesting question because I think just kind of like in broader interplay between AI and coding, I think a lot of coders have picked up kind of these co-piloting tools, but I really don't think that they're at a level of sophistication yet where they could just replace stuff. There are definitely examples of these tools, you give it a prompt and it makes you like a very simple application, but I'm very confident to say that, if that reaches a certain fairly low level of complexity, it becomes a real burden to hone it. And actually we had, like last week, we had the CEO of ZK on talking about how AI is being applied to smart contract code, in particular, like smart contract security. Assessment was like, look, it's smart, it can find some bugs, but it's not at a point where it can find all bugs. And it's certainly not going to be at a point anytime soon where it's going to replace the auditing process, which involves a lot of humans and like human process and so on. So he was actually very bearish on AI, even longer term, kind of fully automating the cybersecurity smart contracting area. So I would say, given the tools you have now, you can probably generate some smart contracts, and that's really cool. How safe those smart contracts are, not totally clear. Might still need cybersecurity audits by humans. But if what it's definitely doing, and this is palpable, and a lot of people are talking about this, is it's automating certain aspects of this process that are just making people more productive. And it might even be having an impact on hiring. Like I've heard a lot of anecdotal kind of data points about big firms being less willing to hire like junior developers right now. But David, I wanted to actually kind of go back to, we were talking about kind of consumer adoption. I wanted to ask you to give your view on this question of whether, do you think like ultimately blockchain adoption will happen first through consumer use cases, kind of bottom up from people using games and NFTs and demanding, decentralized financial services and things like that? Or do you think it's more of a process that's top down where, Goldman is integrating products for its customers and, ETFs and institutions are adopting blockchains for various purposes and then kind of mandating a little bit to their customers of what they should use. So do you have a strong view either way?
Very strong view that almost all large wave tech adoption is driven by consumers. I mean, it's just the history of tech is what shows us that. So it's not, I'm picking between two choices that we don't know the answer to. Just looking backwards, that's what we've seen. It's certainly been true of crypto. It was true of the internet. It's true of mobile devices. Do you remember how long businesses tried to keep you from bringing your phone to the office? And you have to have two phones. You can't use your regular phone. This is just the history of tech. Is the consumer is the tip of the spear and drags along. I mean, we even went through this period of the consumerification of SaaS, the consumerification of business applications. Like we went through several years where it's, wait, I get home and my productivity apps are way better than the ones I'm using in the office, right? Because the office is on old tech. I think we'll continue to see most of adoption of crypto be driven by what we call retail investors in crypto, but we really mean consumers doing consumery things, and the TradFi follows. However, it's helpful when TradFi comes in the case, because so many of crypto's applications are financial in nature, and so much financial activity globally is controlled by TradFi, large business institutions. So it's good to have them in. But look at everything, all the data that you and I look at that gives us confidence that we're still onto something in crypto, where there's evidence of usage. Stable coins being, the first real killer app. This is individual wallet user more than anything else, right? It's not yet bank to bank settlement over crypto rails. It's a little bit of that. Visa's made some amazing announcements about it, but probably, PayPal and Robinhood and Stripe are the more modern companies that are looking at adopting things like stablecoin. And USDC exists, and USDT exists not because of some, large banking institutions, right? So I just feel like we're going to continue to see the source of energy be individuals more than TradFi for some time. And then they come in and then it gets really big.
And we had Jeremy Allaire on the other week here, and I asked him this kind of similar question. He's, a lot of the circle adoption has been bottom up. It's really been driven by people wanting to use blockchains as a rails of paying, USD. And of course, a lot of that has been Web3 consumers, you might say.
And the easier we make it too, like by putting it into Robinhood and putting it into PayPal and putting it into, Apple Wallet, right? I think Apple will be one of the last to do it, but once it's on the phone and really easy, that just really accelerates things.
But David, one maybe like counter example that I can think of in the past, let me know what you think about this, is in the past, gaming consumers have sort of rejected the ideas of, adding cryptocurrencies or even tokenizing in-game items. And it feels like that's one area where it does have to go top down. It's like some big company has to, like Epic Games or something has to make that leap and just say, look, here's a product with this stuff. It's clearly better, and that's why you should use it, because it doesn't feel like the consumers are going to reach for it themselves. So what do you say to that?
I have a different view. I think what you're referring to was this moment when NFTs were introduced into a few games and a bunch of gamers rejected it loudly. And I think that was eminently predictable, because if you know the gamer mentality, the way that was introduced felt like a cash grab. It felt like big companies asking gamers to just pony up more money for stuff that they didn't want to buy. And that's just predictably a bad message. Versus, I mean, just empirically, would you like to forever own the items that you both win and purchase in games and have them have a true independent resale value? Or would you like them to be owned by, the gaming conglomerate that's selling you the game? I mean, empirically, I think most gamers would choose the former over the latter, but that's not how this technology or this feature was rolled out. So I think we should watch very carefully what Gunzilla, what Off the Grid is doing, where all of your items are, things that you own, but we don't need to call them NFTs. We don't need to call them blockchain entries, and, we just make them super consumery. But, let's watch and see. But I feel like that was more of a messaging and specific to the way it was rolled out than conceptually wrong.
Okay, that's really good nuance there. And I was going to go to Gunzilla and Off the Grid next, but what are we seeing in Off the Grid, David, that is making us think that this is sort of the start of Web3 gaming that's actually working?
First, just conceptually, here's what they're doing. It's a battle royale type of first-person shooter multiplayer game that has a lot of in-game items, but it has a lot more of them that are both customizable and transferable than you normally would see when a game first starts. And we're talking about things like armor and weapons and other accoutrements, and also vehicles and things like that. But the long-term vision is that third parties can add items into games, not just the game publisher. So you can unlock creativity by a community who is, extending the game. And plugins have been a way that games have been extended by users for a long time, but not all games allow them. So we can use the fact of crypto's standardization to allow for confidence that items can work inside games and then can have a life, inside and outside the game, because they're things that you own. And we've seen, as I mentioned, I think we're up to about 9 million users who have played the game just in the last 2 weeks since its launch. So big numbers, but maybe we'll give it maybe next episode, we'll check in and share the stats.
Awesome. Thank you, David. I guess maybe one more before we head off. Since you're clearly very bullish on consumer adoption, other than gaming, what do you think we'll see the next, call it 18 to 24 months, that might signal some more consumer adoption of?
I think it's payments, and this may slightly contradict my last answer, but it's because of some of the larger mainstream companies adopting blockchain infrastructure and stable coins as a mechanism for, moving money either across border or from consumer to business. We're just going to see real big volumes of payment increase. It really just means, use of stable coins to pay for goods or services. So that's just because it's going to get super convenient. The mainstream networks like it because it's really cheap. It's 24 hours a day, super trackable. Don't have to ask anyone's permission to use these networks. So I think there's going to be this story of this explosive use of crypto rails and stable coins over the next year or two, as for all the different reasons why people move money around. And that's going to be a shock, because I think that actually shrinking the payment market on a per transaction cost basis ultimately can enlarge the market. But when you bring unit costs down, that can sometimes hurt someone's profitability.
Awesome. Thank you so much, David. And thank you everyone for listening. I hope you've enjoyed hearing some of our views at CoinFund on some of these different areas. We talked about technical areas and the intersection of AI and Web3 as it relates to decentralized training. We also talked about consumer versus institutional adoption and gaming and payments as well. So thank you, David, for your views there. If you're building something on the edge of the new internet, we want to know about it. Hit us up on Twitter, on Telegram. My handle is @JBRUKH, JBrook. And David's is @Pacman, Pakman. Make sure you download Mind where you get your podcasts, and we'll be back soon to dig deep and deeper into the blockchain space. Thank you.